So they also, oh, this is not the one I was thinking of. This is going so well. Welcome back. Today's video is a little bit of a hodgepodge. I want to call it sample snippets, but not everything I'm talking about in today's video are samples. So let's just go ahead and call it random reviews. I have 5 fragrances to talk about. These are just 5 fragrances I've discovered probably in the last 8 months or so, some of them more recently than that. And they're fragrances that I haven't spoken about before, so I thought I would share my thoughts. First up, I have a sample of Milky Dragon by Isabelle Larignon. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I believe this was released in 2022 and I bought this sample from Saint Celier. So when I ordered this sample, I didn't know anything about this fragrance or this brand before. I literally went on to the Saint Celier website to have a look at some of their range and just pick out a few that I wanted to try. Top of my list for that particular sample box was Marbet by Eris Parfums. Suffice to say, I really love that one and hopefully I will talk about it soon. But in order to sort of make it worthwhile, I suppose, to order that sample, I ordered a few different ones that I had never heard of before, and this was one of those. So this fragrance is based on the concept of oolong tea. I find it's very sort of dry and woody in the opening. You do get a bit of a tea vibe from it, and to me at that point in the very opening, it's like opening the canister of tea and smelling the tea in its dry state before you add water to it. It's dry, almost dusty, and it has a bit of a sweet undertone to it. But that in itself is very, very subtle, and it becomes much more prominent after about 10 or 15 minutes, but it always remains really subtle throughout the entire wear of the fragrance. There is a bit of a, I want to say, aquatic thread that runs through this fragrance, and it's quite noticeable. And you do, I guess, get a bit of a hint of a milkiness, as the name would suggest, but it's not lactonic specifically. But if you are familiar with oolong tea, and I have drunk oolong tea over the years, I wouldn't say it's my favorite type of tea, but I do get that sort of silky, almost creamy element to it. But I think it's a function of the tea leaf itself, not necessarily through the addition of milk to your tea, because I don't add milk to my oolong tea. There is also a bit of a slight savoury edge to this perfume, which balances really nicely with the sweeter tones that I think come primarily from the plum jam note that's in there. And this fragrance does have an overall green aspect to it, but it is very soft. So there's no sharp, piercing green elements in this perfume, at least not for me. What I really like about this perfume is that it has this sort of hazy demeanor about it that is almost like remembering a dream, and everything is just slightly out of focus. It's just a little bit hazy. That's what this perfume makes me think of, because all of the notes are there and it is quite a substantial and very intriguing note listing, which I will share with you shortly. But everything is just kind of a bit hazy and just slightly out of reach in terms of being able to really pinpoint what it is that you're smelling. And that's what I really like about it. I have to confess though, it isn't a love for me because of that aquatic vibe that's coming through, and I don't know if that's something that's coming from a floral note, or because there is aquatic floral notes listed, but I don't really know what it is. It's a note that is very familiar to me in terms of it's used in a lot of perfumes, and it's used specifically in a lot of aquatic perfumes, and it just doesn't agree with me, and it's a real shame. However, if you like tea fragrances and you don't mind aquatic fragrances and aquatic notes, then you know, this is a really interesting perfume to look into, I think. It has this really interesting contrast of savory versus sweet. And the reason I chose this one instead of Marbet to review in the block of perfumes that I'm talking about today is because there's another fragrance that I'm also talking about today that also has this element of savory and sweet, which I find really intriguing. Although I think it's probably more prominent in this one. Okay, so I'll share the note listing very quickly. I don't normally just list out a bunch of notes, but I feel like this one's so interesting, I wanted to share it. So in the top, we've got bergamot, buchu, which I think is a type of tea, and cardamom. Then you have in the mid, you've got butter, rose ketones, jasmine, ionones, lactones, hazelnut, ozonic notes, clary sage absolute. And then in the base, you've got cashmeran, Virginia cedar, fir balsam, and oak moss. So I guess now reading that, I can kind of understand this dusty kind of element that I get. It is tea-like. There is woody elements, there's floral elements. Maybe I do get a nuttiness, and maybe that's where that body that I was talking about earlier that is naturally in oolong anyway, maybe it is a bit of a nuttiness that imparts that. And so I guess that makes sense to have the hazelnut in there. But very interesting perfume. I wouldn't necessarily call this milky as in being lactonic, as I said, but it's a very interesting tea fragrance. I don't dislike it, but again, I don't really get along with that sort of aquatic note. So for that reason, I don't anticipate this will ever be a love for me. But I do find it just really interesting to smell because of that savory butter element mixing in with the florals and the green notes and the woody elements. So that is Milky Dragon by Isabelle Lavignon. Next up is one that was very kindly sent to me by a little boutique in a little town called Brighton in Victoria, Australia. And the boutique is named after the owner, Rebecca Thompson, and it's a collaboration with a company called Metascent, which is based in Melbourne, and they are sort of an artisanal perfume boutique, I think, and they run perfume making workshops. So Rebecca ran a workshop with some of her more frequent clientele and Metascent, and the result was this perfume called Holi. So the opening to this fragrance really reminds me of my favourite lemongrass and ginger tea, which happens to be made by a company called Love Tea, which is an Australian brand that's also based in Victoria. And the interesting thing about that is that there's no lemongrass and no ginger noted in the note listing. But that is exactly what I get when I first spritz this and when I first put it on my skin. It's very bright, it's very tangy and green, and it has that lemongrass twang to it. And I feel like I also get heat, and it really does, it seriously does smell like ginger. So it has no lemongrass or ginger, but it does have lemon, black pepper, and cardamom. And I think, just going by the note listing, when I looked at those notes together on a page, I went, I can see how they might come together and give the impression of lemongrass and ginger. Anyway, so it's a very bright, effervescent, fresh, but also warming kind of opening. And then after a short time, just a few minutes, you start to get some floral notes coming through. And for me, I get mostly jasmine. Jasmine is very noticeable to me, but it's a very easygoing, easy to like jasmine. It's very light and quite translucent. It doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't feel indolic or anything like that. Yeah, it just feels very translucent, like you could see through it. And then after a little bit longer, I start to detect more in the floral accord, but I don't know if I could ever really tell you without looking at the note listing what those things are. They just come together to form this really beautiful bouquet in the base that smells really exotic, but also very familiar, and there's a sweetness to it as well. So from what I know, from having read the note listing, I believe it's ylang ylang and rose, and I think when I smell it, I go, okay, I think I can get the rose, and I can sort of get the ylang ylang in the sense of that exotic floral element that's there, but it doesn't come off as being a ylang ylang dominant sort of accord, and it certainly doesn't smell banana-y or anything like that. It's just, the whole thing is just really bright, sparkly and translucent and very delicate. As it dries down, it sort of becomes a little bit more musky, but I would say that brightness, that effervescent element to it really lingers, and I have really enjoyed wearing it, particularly as we've had some really disgusting, humid, sticky weather, and this just cuts through the heat and it feels really fresh, feels very clean, and it's just a very pleasant, easy wear. So that is Holi by Rebecca Thompson and Metascent. All right, so next up we have a full bottle that I purchased. This is Babylonia by Ormond Jane. This opens with a burst of really fresh, sweet blackcurrant. And in that first few seconds, it's very fruity and juicy, but very quickly, a lot more sweetness starts to come through. And it's like an ambery vanillic sort of sweetness. So it's got a bit of body to it. I have to admit, when that hits, it's quite overwhelmingly sweet to me, to the point where I start to struggle to discern what sits behind this wall of sweetness. I can smell the blackcurrant and I can smell sweetness. There is a praline note in here, which I think is the main thing that's contributing to that sweetness, along with a vanilla note. But yeah, I feel like that is mostly all I can smell for quite a while. Eventually I do start to get more of a resinous sort of tone to it. The blackcurrant stays throughout the wear on this fragrance for me. I can detect it the whole way through, but eventually the sweetness does start to settle a little bit. It always remains a sweet fragrance, but I can start to pick up other things after a little while. So the first thing I start to notice is this spicy resinous aspect, which I think comes from the benzoin. Eventually it does dry down to being more of a sweet, orris-y, musky floral. And I think the way the florals are done in here, they have this sort of sophisticated edge to them. They have a very elegant profile, but it does get drowned out a little bit, I think, by this sweetness, the praline and the vanilla and the blackcurrant. I would love to be able to smell a version of this perfume where the florals are more dominant and those sweeter elements are toned down a little bit. I haven't read the marketing around this one, but given that it's part of the Route de la Soie line, I feel like the sweetness must be part of the concept of this perfume. But for me, it's just not my favorite thing, because that, for me, that sweetness really overrides, and particularly when I put it on my skin. When I put it on paper, after a couple of hours, I'm really getting much more of that floral bouquet, and you get this beautiful musky, orris-y floral alongside that blackcurrant and the benzoin. But unfortunately, when I put it on my skin, I just feel like all I can smell is the sweetness and the blackcurrant, and I really, really have to look for the rest of it, basically. So as you can probably gather, this perfume was a blind buy for me. Even though Ormond Jane fragrances and this line in particular are distributed in Australia, this particular perfume does not seem to be distributed here. So I did purchase it blindly, and it obviously, as you can probably gather, was one of the ones that did not work out for me, which is a very rare occurrence when it comes to Ormond Jane for me. So a friend of mine recently smelled this. She loved it, and consequently it is now about to be rehomed. So farewell, Babylonia. It has been nice to meet you, but I'm afraid this is where our paths diverge. Yes, different look. The filming of video fell off the rails on the weekend. The SD card got full, consequently did not finish filming the video. So I still have 2 fragrances that I just want to run through, and I have 20 minutes before I have to run off to my next meeting. All right, so the next fragrance that I wanted to talk about was one from a company called Plume Impression. Before Christmas, I ordered their Discovery set, and their Discovery set at the moment comes like this, and it's got 6 fragrances in there. But they do actually have 4 more fragrances that they have since added to their line. So they also send out the additional 4. One that's really stood out to me, and I don't have any. It's nothing like being organized, hey? Although I have to say my desk is looking very clean and tidy today. I cleaned it up last night and I'm very much enjoying the space, and I really feel like it helps my brain to focus on what I have to do. What's not helping my brain to focus on what I have to do is I've done something to my neck and shoulder, and I'm not very mobile at the moment and I'm in quite a bit of pain. So my brain is not quite functioning to optimal levels. Okay, so this is not the one I was thinking of because that doesn't smell the way I was thinking it was going to. This is going so well. Okay, so this fragrance, this is Etat de Grâce or de Grâce, or I don't want to say Grâce because I feel like it's not spelt like grass as in French, town grass. It's spelt grace, but it does have an accent on it. The reason this one stood out to me, I think, is because it does remind me of something that I have smelled before, but a long time ago. It has this beautiful, fresh, woody, floral opening. It's got this sort of a bit of fruit in the opening, but it's not overly fruity. I wouldn't consider this to be a fruity floral as such. The florals in here are primarily white florals and primarily tuberose, and I think the marketing around this is a bridal fragrance. I can totally see that because it has this softness about it. It's very ethereal, it's very translucent, it's not too heavy, it's got a hint of sweetness, but it also has this earthiness to it as well. But at the same time, it's also crisp. The overall effect, I guess, is that it doesn't necessarily come off as smelling exactly like tuberose. So if you're not a tuberose fan, then this might be worth checking out. It is a little bit on the green side, but it's not like a green tuberose that you get, say, in Carnal Flower, which is very indolic, very heavy. This is much lighter, it's a lot sweeter, very airy, very clean smelling. This is the bit that I really like. As it dries down further, that really crisp edge to it starts to tone down a little bit, and then you get more of this fruit coming out. Now the fruit in here, I believe, is apricot, and that totally makes sense to me because when I smell it, it reminds me of putting my nose up to an apricot fruit and getting that fuzziness. So it's not a really heavy syrupy apricot, and it's not like a leathery toned osmanthus apricot vibe either. It does smell fruity, but it smells fuzzy. You really get that texture of the apricot. So it eventually does dry down to be this beautiful sort of green toned, ethereal floral. The one thing I will say is that there is an aspect to this which sort of does have a bit of sparkle, and I really like that because it makes it a happy, joyful kind of fragrance. So in addition to tuberose, there's things like peony and oak moss and patchouli, obviously the apricot note. There's carnation as well, a bit of tonka. So as you can imagine, it's got this very light floral bouquet, a slight hint of powderiness, but I wouldn't consider this to be a powdery fragrance by any means. As I said, it's just this really bright, joyful element in here, which I think may be partly due to the apricot. This one is really pretty, and it's probably one of the ones that really stood out to me when I first just sprayed them all on paper and had a sniff. There are, I think, about 3 in here that I think are absolutely beautiful. But anyway, so that was a Plume Impression. Really, really enjoying this line at the moment. And if you're like me and you're really having a moment with beautiful, sort of classical French perfumery, those light, airy florals, then I think this line is probably worth checking out. Not all of them are like that though. There are a couple more ambery, sort of boozy fragrances in here as well. So again, I will go through the whole range and film a video on that, but I just wanted to call out the Etat de Grâce, which is one that I've been testing pretty regularly over the last few weeks, and I've just been really, really enjoying it. I feel like I'm coming right up to the camera. I'm getting a little bit too excited. How am I going for time? I've got 10 minutes. Okay, so last but not least is this one. It's called French Kiss, and it's by a brand called Babylonia. This is a house that I discovered purely because they sent me a bottle, I think 2 years ago, called Richness, and I really liked that. It was kind of a cashmere-y, musky, woody fragrance, a little bit aldehydic as well, and it reminded me a little bit of Blanche by Rado, and I do actually still wear that quite a lot. It's very much a fragrance that I like to wear either to bed or just spritz around the bedroom before bed, or as a sort of a white t-shirt, very clean, crisp fragrance. But anyway, we're not reviewing that one. We're reviewing this one, which is French Kiss. This is one they sent to me a few months ago, and I was a little bit slow to talk about it. The note listing is really interesting on this one. So this is, I would classify, I think it's classified as a spicy floral. If you look on Fragrantica or maybe on their website, I think they call it a spicy floral. To me, I think it sits more in the aromatic floral category because it is quite green. In the opening, you get this really bright blast of verbena, and it is really, really nice. I mean, I love verbena. There's neroli in here as well. But that verbena just is so tangy, it makes my mouth water. And I really, really love that in the opening. I could have sworn that there might have been lavender or something in here. It doesn't smell like lavender, but there's something in here that has a bit of a cooling effect like lavender has sometimes. And I really love it. I think it makes it really fresh and bright and very uplifting. It then does in the mid develop what I consider to be a bit of an aquatic note. You've got things like magnolia, neroli. There is meant to be a cherry blossom in here as well. I'm not sure if I depict cherry blossom exactly, but there is a very light freshness to the floral bouquet that's in here. However, I think in the mid, for me at least, and for like a fairly good portion of the wear, what dominates is this sort of almost aquatic vibe, which I have to admit doesn't really agree with me. And you know, if you've watched me for any length of time, you know that I just don't like aquatic fragrances and I don't like aquatic notes. So for that reason, that spoils this fragrance for me. I would love to get more of this very provincial feeling floral bouquet that sits underneath it, because the florals are really light. They're very, as I said, they're very aromatic. They're kind of woody. They're a little bit green. And I do love neroli, as you know, and I think the magnolia also provides this sort of almost golden aromatic sort of floral element to it. Again, this is another fragrance that's very sparkly, and I feel like it has a very happy tone to it. And the overall effect of it is that I imagine myself walking through, you know, a beautiful meadow, maybe in spring, in the south of France, of course, because it just has that feel to it. The sun is shining, my skin is warm, I can smell the earth a little bit with the woods and the florals, the way they're done. I feel like there is a bit of a maybe a woody vibe, slightly earthiness to them. They kind of feel realistic, I guess. You know those flowers that when you walk out into a field and you've got all these wildflowers, and the flowers themselves don't have a scent, but you've got this smell of flowers like petals. That's sort of what is sitting in the base for me with this fragrance. But when I put this on, actually on the paper, I'm getting a lot of that verbena. But when I put it on my skin, that aquatic element really just jumps out so much more. And it sort of unfortunately drowns out this beautiful tangy verbena and these really gorgeous delicate floral bouquet that sits underneath. So unfortunately this is a no for me, but if you're quite partial to, I guess, aquatic type notes, you might also enjoy this. Oh, and I just realized I was mucking around with my settings the other day, and I've just realized I've somehow set a filter on here. So let me just turn this off because I don't like it. It makes me look like I'm made of plastic. So sorry about that. all of that segment is going to be me with a plastic filter over my face, but it was not intentional. So that is French Kiss by Bozo, and I do apologise for all the banging in the background because we do have some people doing some works on the house today. And thank you so much to the Bozo team for sending this to me. I forgot to mention, but there is listed in here a corn note. And that is sort of, I have to admit, what intrigued me about this fragrance and why I said, yes, I would love to smell it, because I was so intrigued how they were going to put corn into this fragrance. There was corn and meringue. And I thought that is a really interesting combination. So the corn, I think in here, I don't smell corn, but what I do smell is in that floral bouquet in the mid and in the base, I get this slightly vegetal, slightly savory, but also sweet feel. And obviously the sweetness comes from the florals. It also probably comes from that meringue note, but I feel like corn has also got a natural sweetness to it as well. And I feel like there's this corn note maybe behaves a little bit like, say, ambrette does in some other fragrances when it's used in a really subtle way. So ambrette is a musk note that is derived from plants, and it imparts, to me, what I get when I smell ambrette in fragrances is that it has this almost vegetal vibe. And I think the corn is doing a similar thing, but the corn has a bit more sweetness than, say, an ambrette note would have, and it's not as musky. So the corn imparts this sort of vegetal savory element to the floral bouquet that sits in here, and it just, I don't know, it somehow ties it all together, gives it just a hint of sweetness. It balances out what could potentially have been a really heavy sweetness from the meringue note. And in fact, if I hadn't read that there was meringue in here, I would never have picked it up, because I don't get that super sugary, sherbety, fluffy feel that I would expect from a meringue note. So overall, I think what I'm saying is that I think, you know, the notes blend really well in here, and I think they're just really nicely balanced. There's just the right amount of sweetness. It's very fresh. There's something very cooling about it as well. And I think ironically, what's making this feel cool is whatever is probably giving it that aquatic feel. So in a way that's good, because it makes the fragrance feel fresh, but because I'm not really down with aquatic notes or aquatic sort of elements in fragrances, it's a no from me. That is a wrap on this video, finally. Let me know if there's anything that you've been sampling lately that has jumped out at you and that you've been really enjoying, or anything that you've been sampling and maybe you didn't enjoy. I've got a meeting to get to. I will see you in the next video. Bye.